everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Putting People Analytics to Work. I am Amy Wilson, Vice President of HCM Products at Workday, and today it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Josh Bersin, a pillar in the HR community. Josh founded Bersin in 2001 to provide research and advisory services. He is currently responsible for Bersin by Deloitte's long-term strategy and market eminence. Bersin by Deloitte is the leading provider of research-based information, benchmarking, professional development, and advisory consulting services for strategic HR, talent management, leadership development, recruiting, training, and the list goes on. Josh is a frequent speaker at industry events. Many of you have probably seen him in person. He's also been quoted on people and talent management topics in key media, including Harvard Business Review, The Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, and is featured frequently on radio shows across the country. He's a popular blogger for Forbes.com. Hopefully you've all read some of his articles. And he's also been a columnist for Chief Learning Officer magazine. It's safe to say that Josh is a revolutionary thought leader and influencer in our space, human resources, and beyond. And I really like to call Josh a friend as well. So as a reminder, as we continue through the program, please do join us on social media. Include the Workday hashtag and then also Josh's handle, if you will. We are looking forward to the conversation. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Josh. Take it away.
Thank you, Amy. I love being called a revolutionary in the world of HR. What we're going to do for the next 45 or 50 minutes is I'm really going to try to give you a whole background on people analytics, which is one of the most exciting emerging parts of HR. And we're going to give you some background, a little bit of history, tell you what's going on, tell you a little bit about the platform market, and then really give you 7 or 8 really interesting examples that will inspire you to go into your organization and do some of this on your own. And so let me start at the beginning. This idea of data and information in HR is actually has a long history to it. If you look back at where many of the HR practices that we have today started, around the turn of the century, back in the industrial age, Frederick Taylor, who many people sometimes have a negative connotation of, actually started to measure work in a steel manufacturing plant. And those were in the days when employees were basically doing what they were told, and they were basically like machines. And what he learned was by measuring the activities of people in the manufacturing plant, he could improve the productivity of a steel manufacturing facility from 7 bars today to 50 bars per day. That's like 3 or 4 times improvement. And he actually went to the World's Fair around 1900 and demonstrated this and had thousands of people paying attention to what he was doing. Little did he know that he was actually starting the people analytics market, 100 years, almost more than 100 years ago from today. In the 1920s, during the days that Freud was getting started and the concept of psychology was starting to take hold, there was a psychologist by the name of Carl Jung. And he's an interesting history of analytics because what he did is he started to realize that productivity at work was a little more complicated than simply telling people what to do and how many steps to take and how much pig iron to lift and where to turn left and where to turn right. It actually had to do with people's personalities and how they got along with each other and what the nature was of certain teams. And he came up with this concept of psychological types, which were later many years later, 30 years later, turned into the Myers-Briggs assessment, which is one of the most widely used personality assessments in the world. And so he really introduced this idea that we could actually measure psychological impacts of people and their impact on work, and that engagement and happiness and ability to collaborate was part of the equation. During World War I, the United States Army embarked on a massive, essentially, people data project, and that was testing. Because what happened in World War I, if you read the history, was we were basically an agrarian economy, and a lot of young men and women, mostly men, were going into the Army, and they were failing on the job because they couldn't read or write, and they really didn't have the skills they needed to fire a gun or or run a machine or whatever it was that their job was. And so they embarked on a very rigorous testing process which collected millions of records of data on intelligence tests, which were then put into probably file cabinets and used to determine who would be successful in the Army. And then in the 1930s, we had the emergence of what was now called the Hawthorne studies, was tests to try to figure out how people would engage better at work. And if you remember the story of the Hawthorne studies, they found that when they turned the lights off, people became more productive. And then when they turned the lights back on, people became more productive. And they realized that it had nothing to do with the lights. It had to do with the fact that we were paying attention to people and actually giving them some feedback on their work. And so we started realizing that we could collect data about feedback in the work environment, and the work environment had an impact on performance. In the 1950s, when I was actually born, we actually had these assessment centers where people would basically say, if you're slated for management, you go to an assessment center and they give you what was called an inbox test. And it sounds so ridiculous today because now we think about our inbox as being an email. And they literally gave you a bunch of stuff and paperwork to try to figure out if you would sort it into the right piles and do the right things with it. And based on your behavior, they would determine if you were ready for leadership or not. That was actually a process of measurement and analytics. And, of course, that was around the time that computers were starting and mainframe computers, and we started to come up with this idea of building a data warehouse about people. Now, in the early days of analytics in the 1960s and 1970s, we mostly had data about payroll, how long you had worked at a company, maybe a little bit about your demographics and a little bit about your job history, and we would stick it in this data warehouse to manage for HR. And so one of the things that's really changed about people analytics is moving away from this concept of analytics being about HR data and moving it to being about business data. And what happened in the last 20 years since the mainframe is we started to collect talent data. One of the other transformational processes that took place in HR in the 1980s was the beginning of the applicant tracking system, where we would take all these resumes, which at the time were written on paper, and we would scan them into databases, parse them, turn them into actual computer-readable data, and try to score whether we had good candidates. And believe it or not, for those of you who don't know this, applicant tracking systems actually do try to read your resume and try to figure out if your job qualifications and your work experience matches to the job. They don't do a super good job of that, but that's been going on for about 15 or 20 years, and that's part of the history of this market. Now we're really in a new era, and we're really in an era where most companies have lots and lots of talent data. Most companies have multiple, one or more talent management systems, including recruiting, learning, compensation, performance management, different parts of employee engagement systems, and we're trying to figure out what we can do with that data to predict the performance of people. And I think the book that best characterizes where we are with people analytics is the book Moneyball. And if any of you read the book, and a lot of you have probably seen the movie, you remember that the baseball scouts, before the use of data, were making all their decisions on who to hire and who to recruit based on judgment, based on experience, based on their own personal beliefs on who would be the best player. And what the data basically showed in the book and the movie was that most of their judgments were wrong, and that it was better for people to get walks than it was to try to hit home runs, and it was better to get on base than it was to strike out, and so forth. Many, many things were learned by looking at data. And that is really the history of where we are today. By the way, we're really not at the end of this yet. I would say over the next couple of years, we're going to be finding a lot of new data that we can bring into people analytics, data from sociometric data, our location, who we've been hanging around with. There's actually a vendor now that sells a badge, an employee badge, that listens to your voice, keeps track of where you are, understands who you're having lunch with, what kind of meetings you're in, what building you're in, how much travel you're doing, and that's all data that can be used as well to try to figure out what we can do to make the work environment better and make people more productive. So that's kind of the history of this, and the reason I like to bring up the history is that this isn't really a new idea. What we're really doing is transforming and improving a lot of ideas that have been around for more than 100 years on how to do a better job of taking advantage of the information we have. And by the way, one of the things that, I'd like to remind people is if you look at, GDP around the world, and it's, multi-trillion dollars, roughly 30 to 40% of GDP in most countries goes to payroll. It goes to people. So for all the things we're going to measure in business, if we're going to measure financials, we're going to measure manufacturing, if we're going to measure marketing, if we're going to measure customers, we should be measuring and trying to optimize work by the employees. And so people analytics, as you'll see near the end of the presentation, has huge ROI when you do it well because there's so much money being spent and so much opportunity to improve. Now, when you go and you look at analytics in HR, the first thing you have to look at is what are the problems we're trying to solve. And just as a little overview, the number one problem around the world today, based on the research we've recently done at Deloitte, is culture and engagement. What can we do to attract, retain, engage, and inspire the team that we have? And that is a complicated problem. We have lots of things to read on that. I won't go through it today, but many of the analytics cases I'm going to show you at the end of the webinar are about how to predict retention and better understand what it is that's making people excited about work and what it is that's not making them excited about work. The second biggest problem is leadership. Every study I've ever done in this industry has shown that the number one or number two issue is leadership, the continuous development of leadership, the tough decisions about who should become a leader, what it would take to become a successful leader, what are the patterns of success in this company versus another company that create great leaders. That is a huge opportunity for analytics, and I'll show you some examples of that. The third is the issue of skills and learning. We just had a big discussion about that recently. Today, the learning gap in organizations is the third highest gap rated, and it's very closely tied with leadership. A year ago, it was the 8th highest gap. So it's dramatically improved in importance. And the reason it's improved in importance is we are in a skills-driven economy. The learning curve is the earning curve. So if you can learn better and be better at your job and be better technically capable of doing the job around you, you will make more money. And so a lot of the analytics that you can now run, and I'll show you how this works in a minute, will teach you where the skills gaps are, what it would take for somebody to become more capable in their job, what are the appropriate learning experiences, and so we can directly impact that. And we can go down through this, but each one of these talent issues can be directly impacted by analytics. And then as you can see from this chart, and I'll let you read this chart later when you get a chance to look at the slides, there's some very gritty, important questions that your executives and your HR executives are asking that really require data. And by the way, every one of these questions, you could probably guess what the answer is, and you'd probably be wrong, because most of the time when you use gut feel to answer a lot of these questions, you miss something that the data would tell you. And so what we're really trying to do with people analytics is better inform our business leaders and HR how to answer these critical questions. Now, one of the things I want to do before I give you a little bit of data about the marketplace and give you some examples is just define what analytics is. It's kind of a little bit of an overused term right now, and between analytics and big data, it appears all the time. There really is a whole range of analytic or reporting needs in organizations. The first and most simplest problem is simply reporting. How many employees do we have? What is our turnover rate? How many people have completed this course? Who has not completed it? What is our skill level? Just this is a major problem for organizations, and I'll show you why that is in a minute. We have multiple heterogeneous systems. There usually isn't a data dictionary. The data is not clean, and so forth. So that's the first thing. The second thing you have to do is take that information, that reporting information, and make sense of it. And that's really where you get to analysis, and I call that what's going on. How do I slice that data by location, by demographic, by department, by business unit, by level in the organization to make sense of the numbers that we have? The third and the more sexy area, which is much less prevalent, is to try to predict something. Based on the information that we've determined, what is correlated to what And can we predict what might happen under a given condition? So, for example, one of the things that companies are very heavily worried about because of the data I showed you earlier is retention. How do we know who's going to leave and why? Well, it turns out that you can predict the likelihood of retention or retention risk based on the level of skills and capability of the people that you hire, the relative quality of the sourcing tools, and I'll show you an example of this in an insurance company in a minute. You can predict if you have the right person in the right job, but you have to back up and look at that data in a holistic way and correlate those that leave and those that don't leave against the data on the left. The second example that's very common is customer service. I was on the phone with a large client, actually a Workday client a couple of weeks ago, actually it was a couple of days ago. We were talking about diversity. Virtually every HR department has a diversity initiative, diversity programs, diversity measures, and they don't really know the impact of diversity, but they'd like to know. Well, this particular company has correlated the relationship between diversity, and it's a healthcare company, and employee engagement and customer service. And they are proving to themselves that when they hire a more diverse workforce in their health service organization, they actually get better customer service. So that gives the whole HR department and the business leaders a much greater incentive and much better information on why and how they should build a diverse workforce instead of simply calling it an HR program. And here's another example, toxic employees. A toxic employee is not somebody that you eat and get sick from. It's actually an employee that does something at work that's illegal. So it's somebody that steals, that perhaps commits sexual harassment, or does something that causes them to be terminated. It turns out a company did some analysis of toxic employees and found that there's a direct relationship between people who behave like that at work and the way they behave during the interview process. And what this particular vendor found out was that you can predict the people that are likely to do these kinds of things at work because they over-exaggerate their skills in certain areas during the job interview process. And this is in a certain particular industry and a certain particular type of job. Again, so if you have that information, you can go back to the left and you can do a much smarter job of deciding who to hire based on the behavior and the characteristics of that person during the interview process. Many, many examples like that are possible. Each one will be different for your company depending on the business issues that you have. Now, where are we in all this? It's a wonderful idea. The concepts make sense. It seems kind of fun, seems kind of exciting. But how do we get there from here? Well, it turns out, I would say we're probably 2 or 3 years into a decade-long journey of people analytics. And I talk to a lot of companies that are doing this, and we find that there are some really incredibly creative, successful organizations, and they tend to be in industries like insurance and financial services, where they have a lot of analytics people. But most companies are not there yet. Here's what we found. The first is people analytics today is not building an HR data warehouse. That's all very well and good, and you may need to do that as part of your process. But in and of itself, no CEO or head of operations is really going to get very excited about that. In fact, they're probably not going to really care. They want to know if you're improving sales productivity, if you're reducing errors or accidents, if you're improving customer service, reducing downtime, or reducing fraud. So what we really need to do is rethink people analytics today from the way it was conceived 10 years ago as really analyzing the people drivers of business. And that's really where the action is. And if you think about it that way, you'll find yourself getting very, very excited and lots of positive feedback and funding from your own organization. Now, one of the problems, of course, in doing this is that most companies do not have their data management in place. And what we found when we studied about 350 companies through research was that there are really 4 levels of maturity that you have to go through. And I would venture to say that you have to go through these steps. The first is level 1. More than half the companies we talked to are really dealing with reporting. The left side of that picture that I showed you earlier. They're really just trying to make sure they have a quality data set that they can rely on, that's trusted, that won't get them in trouble. And by the way, let me just make a comment up here. There's a natural tendency for a lot of smart people to say, let's pull a data set out of the system, put it in Excel, run some correlations, and see what we learned. There's a lot of danger in doing that because if you come to a conclusion about who to hire or productivity or training or something else that might involve a lot of money later, and you show this to the business execs, and they come back to you and say, wait a minute, that data doesn't look right. There's a seasonal aspect to the data, or you pulled it on the wrong month, or you pulled it in the wrong city, and you find out that your data is incorrect, you really hurt your credibility. So it's very, very important that you have a clean and accurate set of data before you run some of these analyses, because the impact of some of these analyses are going to be very high. Level 2 is companies that have cleaned up their data act, and they've really gotten to the point where they have a good reporting infrastructure, they have tools, they have dashboards, they have good, easy access to the information, and that's 30% of the companies. And then you get to companies after they've done that, they can actually start performing correlations, looking at statistical analysis, and a very small number at that level, and even smaller at the level that they can do predictive modeling. Now, the frustration for me as an analyst, having sort of studied this for about 5 years, is that it's taking so long for companies to get there, and here's why. The level of effort that you need to go up that maturity level is very high during going from level 1 to level 2, because from level 1 to level 2 is mostly data management, and it's a lot of data cleanup. And unfortunately, during that process, you get almost no credit for it. You don't get any fancy results. You don't have any wonderful predictions, and it usually takes a year or two. One of the clients I talked to a couple of months ago, a large insurance company, told me that he thinks it's going to take them 3 years to build an integrated, consistent database of their people before they'll really be able to do analytics. But he's willing to invest in that. On the other hand, the value comes after you've finished that. And so there's kind of a choke point a year or two into this where you start to see big results. And one of the things that you'll have to do within your organization is convincing your HR executives, your business executives, your CFO, that if you don't make this investment to build the quality data that you need, you won't reach this crossing point, this tipping point, and you won't be able to do the analysis you want. The analogy, of course, would be finance. How many people would be willing to run a company when they didn't have accurate accounts receivable or accurate billings or accurate cash balances? Nobody would tolerate that. Yet we're willing to tolerate inaccurate information about our people, which are our largest expense. So I could give you a lot of information and arguments as to why you should invest in this, but you're going to have to deal with the fact that in most cases it's going to be a year or two of infrastructure and data cleanup before you get this high level of value. Now, the lucky thing is people are spending money on this. Every year we look at it, we see more interest, and slowly the market is moving. And we also see that the companies that are doing it are getting tremendous returns. In fact, I would venture to say that if you're in a highly competitive industry, if you're in retail, if you're in high tech, if you're in financial services, those of you that are doing people analytics are going to start winning people away and better recruiting candidates and competing directly with those who are not. And it's going to become a competitive edge to be able to make smarter decisions about your people. If you look at things like Glassdoor and you look at employee engagement and look at employee turnover, it's pretty much of a bell curve of companies from good to bad. And if you look at the companies on the right, they're far more profitable, they're growing faster, they're more innovative, they're managing their people better, and they have more information about what's going on in their organization. So this is very much of a strategic, basically, battle or war for talent that's going on, and you have to make the investment. Why is it going so slowly, though? What is it that's holding people back? I would say the biggest issue is simply this, and this is why we're doing this webinar with Workday, and I'm sitting at Workday today, is that we have a pretty ugly picture in most companies when it comes to data management for HR. We have multiple systems, we have multiple payroll systems, we have multiple talent systems, we have legacy systems. Much of the data was input by administrators who didn't have data quality standards. There may have been, there may have been fields that don't even enforce data quality standards. So you have multiple records in there that are inconsistent with each other. There's no ownership or governance of the data. We don't necessarily have time series, the time seasonality of the data clearly identified, and we don't have what's called a data dictionary. And by the way, data dictionary is not a complicated concept. It's very important, and that is a clear set of definitions in your company for how each data element will be computed. How will we compute turnover? How will we compute the number of employees? Do we include contractors? Do we include part-timers? Do we include people that are semi-retired? You know, all these things, unfortunately, are a little bit complicated to define, and if you don't define them well and you run some analysis, you won't really be able to interpret the results. The other thing in addition to data is the team. Now, during my experience as an analyst for 15 or so years, I've watched this part of HR grow, and it started in functional areas. We had an analytics person in learning. We had an analytics person in comp. We had an analytics person in engagement. We had an analytics person, maybe in recruiting. Each of those people was running analytics on that function. They were trying to organize or optimize that part of HR. None of them saw the relationship between all that stuff with each other. If you think about the definition of people analytics as I described it now, we really need to move to a completely integrated analytics team that looks at many, many sources of data. I was just on the phone yesterday with the head of analytics at a tech company, and she was telling me that one of the CEO's largest agendas at this company, and this is a very well-known, successful company, is to create a new culture. And they have 5 cultural values, new cultural values for the company. And she said her job is to figure out how to measure the progression of the company towards those 5 values. And she's going to have to look at everything. She's going to have to look at recruiting process, engagement process, learning, all the things in HR as well as many business measures to do that. So this analytics team needs to be complete and needs to be integrated. The other thing you can see from this chart is that building people analytics is not simply hiring a statistician or a PhD and giving them a spreadsheet and some data. It's much more complex. As you'll see in a couple minutes when I go through some of the examples, the problem is not just doing the analysis, it's actually taking action as a result of the analysis. So what these people analytics teams do, the more advanced companies, is they turn into consulting organizations. One of the people analytics groups we've been working with for about 5 or 6 years, actually part of a healthcare provider, they actually have consultants who go into the hospitals. They ask the line business execs, what are some of the operational problems they're having, whether it be inspections or turnover or people coming into work late, whatever it may be. And then they go back and they do analysis on the data, and they come back to those leaders with recommendations for results based on the data that they've captured that informs that result. So they're really functioning as business consultants, not just data analysts. Obviously, you have to have a great relationship with IT. You have to know what the business issues are in your company. And you have to be curious because you're going to find things that you probably didn't know. Interesting thing about some of the stories I'm going to share you in a minute is most of the examples that we find are companies identifying things that were not obvious before they did the analysis. So, people are a complicated thing, and we don't always do what you think we're going to do. And sometimes only the data will tell you exactly how and why the business is operating the way it is. The other thing about analytics is that once you build a team, the team will grow. This is a retailer that's been doing it for about 7 years, and they have moved organization design, so spans and layers, for example, how many people are, what is the management depth, and what is the span and layer in each part of the organization. Whenever they do a reorg, the analytics group gets involved because they know a lot about the workforce that nobody else knows. They have workforce planning in this group. They do the engagement surveys in this group. They look at learning measurement in this group. And they also have business consultants that actually go out and advise business leaders on various operational problems. This particular company started their journey in analytics when they had labor relations problems. And they actually had the threat of a labor union coming in, and they quickly developed a process of surveying their employees in the stores to try to figure out what they could do to, make them happier and possibly prevent a labor union from coming in. That data, data set, that project kicked off a lot of looking at data about the workforce, and they looked at some things and they noticed some things about sales productivity and management productivity they hadn't seen before, which 5 years later turned into this whole analytics function that analyzes virtually everything that goes on in their stores. But it started with one simple thing. So it's going to take you time to build this team, but I can guarantee you from all the companies I've talked to that as you build the team and you get more consultative and aligned with the business, you're going to add a tremendous amount of value. And when you look at the history of these organizations, these level 3 and level 4 organizations, you find that their expertise grows. The first year or two, they're really focused on core data collection and data analysis. Then a couple of years later, they look at visualization and how to make data more available to managers and how to translate data into decision-making tools. And then later, they look at storytelling and much more sophisticated ways of communicating data to line managers. And I'll give you an example of that as we go a little bit further along. Okay, so that's a little bit about the market. But there's something else going on that I just want to mention, and this is one of the reasons I'm here with Workday, is that I really think one of the reasons, if we look at other parts of business, one of the reasons people analytics has been slow is because of the platform market itself. If you go back and you look at some of the other areas of analytics in business, ERP, financial analytics, logistics, supply chain, marketing and sales analytics, those markets all started just like this. There were some forward-thinking companies that had little projects, little teams, and they threw together little databases, and they started analyzing data, and they found some cool things, and they made a name for themselves, and they beat their competition because they could do something a little bit better than somebody else. And then a software vendor came along and said, oh, that's cool, we'll build a market, we'll build a tool around that. And little by little, the infrastructure was built out so that we had platforms that did end-to-end financial operations and analytics. So in the ERP area, virtually every ERP provider has analytics on financials, manufacturing, and logistics. Every CRM system, whether it be Salesforce or somebody else, has all sorts of analytics on leads, customer behavior, customer attention, and you can get incredible tools from now cloud-based providers that analyze almost every part of your marketing and sales operation. That is essentially what's happening in HR. And companies like Workday are really leading this charge with the integrated solutions that Workday has offered in the Workday Talent Insights. But we're in the early days. And so those of you that are, thinking about sort of the mess you have in your old HR department and the many databases and the inconsistency of data, one of the things that I think will be important is getting a platform and a platform provider that can bring all that data together and make sense out of it. Now, one of the other things that I think drives this market is the fact that the platform vendors today are far more sophisticated than they've ever been before. If you look at companies like Workday and others, they have engineering teams, data scientists, and incredibly strong IT skills because they're not just writing software anymore. They're running an operation. They're running hundreds of companies' databases for them. So they have all those skills. They have advanced databases. They have Hadoop. They have highly parallel technology. They have embedded analytics technology. They have cloud services. They have built data definitions that are designed to be consistent in their platforms. So whether it be Workday or another vendor, if you use their tool or their system, you're pretty much guaranteed that the data will be consistent. They have built workflows that move processes across the organization so you can predict that the data will make sense as it is used around the organization. And they have embedded analytics tools that allow you to look at the data in real time with the right level of security. That, look, a lot of the analytics market has been purchasing small tools, whether it be Tableau, Visier, Business Objects, et cetera. Those are great tools, but they don't have the security and the embedded nature of the tools that are available from the platform vendors. So I think the platform vendors are going to have a big lever up there. And now, if you look at the top of this chart, companies like Workday and others are building very sophisticated analytics models. They have statisticians. They are building predictive models based on the results of many customers, and they have the opportunity to leverage and scale their models by working with many, many clients and seeing which models work best under what conditions, under what industry, what company size, and what business cycle. So just like in the marketing world, it took virtually a decade for all the little Salesforce automation tools and so forth to get integrated together into integrated platforms with analytics, so the same thing is happening in talent. And that's where I think this market is going to go. It's going to move from a build-it-yourself to a buy-it market. Now, there's still some questions, and I think these are questions you should legitimately ask your vendor, including Workday. Are these models proven? Can they be verified? Will they work across multiple industries? Will they work in my company? I think those are very fair questions you should ask any vendor. Will the vendors take the time to test and validate the models? I hate to tell you this, but there's probably a little bit too much of this out there on the market, and some of it's kind of, slideware a little bit more than reality. I think it's important. We don't know how to validate the tools in the market or the vendors' models that are coming out in the industry yet. So you'll have to sort of test them yourselves and see if they appear to be working in companies like you. How long will it take you to prepare and integrate the data you have into the vendor's platform? Deloitte, and particularly the organization that I'm a part of, does a lot of work with companies to bring their ERP and HR systems together. It takes years. It takes 2 or 3 years in most cases, even if you buy a fresh, brand new system like Workday, to get all the data put together and implemented in the organization. So you still have to take time to do that. And then the last question is, amongst the vendors that are providing analytics tool, will they provide them in an affordable platform where you can actually afford to buy them? And I think the time will tell. They'll probably be expensive for a while, and they'll get cheaper over time as more companies buy them. And then which ones will be really the tools that will attract the ecosystem of scientists, of consultants, of engineers that want to really use the tools to build better industry solutions. Now, I'm certainly a big fan of Workday, or I wouldn't be sitting here, but I think it's a very important trend in the market for the platform vendors to be bringing these analytics tools all together so that you can buy much more of an off-the-shelf solution. And then finally, the other question that has yet to be answered is how much data is really going to be included. When you look at an analytics problem like the ones I'm going to show you in a minute, you'll see that there's a virtually unlimited amount of data that you could potentially apply. So if you're looking at, for example, retention, do we want to look at the behavior of people on Facebook and LinkedIn? Will that predict retention? It actually will, but that data is a little bit harder to get. Do we want to look at somebody's sociometric data if it's available? So this is sort of some of the exciting new areas of analytics that are emerging and that I think you can just watch out for in the future as the market continues to mature. Now, let me conclude and give you a couple of inspirational examples to show you that this is not as complicated or maybe mystical as it may sound, and then we'll open up to some questions. So what I did is I put together 8 sort of myths similar to Moneyball that I'll just talk you through very briefly and give you a couple things to inspire you about what analytics could do in your organization. And here's the 8 myths, and I won't walk through them right now. We'll just go through them one at a time. Okay, first one. Is it true that if we hire people from top universities with top grades, we'll get better performance? Most companies believe that to be true. Most CEOs believe that to be true. And, of course, a lot of universities would like you to believe that to be true. It turns out in several companies that I've talked to, one insurance company, another financial services company, another technology company, it is not true. And actually, the insurance company, I've written about this company before, did an extensive statistical analysis of the turnover rate and the sales performance of their salespeople in their insurance business and found there was absolutely no relationship to the pedigree of their college or the grade point average. No relationship whatsoever. The most highly correlated relationship that would predict sales performance in this particular company was whether there were typos on the resume. That, now, this is typically what happens. You think about that, like, that's obvious, right? No, it's not obvious. People would not have necessarily thought of that. What they found is that the two most predictive qualities of high-performing salespeople in this particular company were the quality of their resume and the fact that they had sales experience in the automotive industry or some related industry related to automotive, because a lot of what they were selling was automotive insurance. Simple finding. They changed the way they sourced and recruited people. Sure, they still continued to look at grade point average, but they put it on a much lower level of priority. And their sales, 2 years later, their sales productivity was up by more than 30% as a result of changing that number. Now, that would pay for the whole analytics program, team, staff, technology, just that one project. And most companies can do that analysis and do a much better job of figuring out how to hire the right salespeople. Second example, bank. In Canada, large distributed retail bank has many remote branches. They were finding patterns of fraud and theft. And, of course, the natural reaction to that is, let's do some training. We'll do compliance training. We'll make sure everybody goes through a rigorous compliance program, and then we'll try to reduce this kind of behavior. No impact whatsoever after the training. This is a very common story, by the way. The gut reaction to a lot of business problems is training, and a lot of times training doesn't solve the problem. What they found after doing a couple months of analysis and looking at all sorts of people's data was that the most highly correlated factor that was contributing to fraud was the number of miles between the branch and the district manager, simply implying that these are branches that were not getting visited very often. They were being left alone, and the employees in these branches were just taking it upon themselves to do things that they probably shouldn't do. Once they came to that conclusion, it was a simple fix, change the rotation and location of the district managers, and they could dramatically reduce the fraud. Third example, large food service company that manages hospitals and prisons and universities and does basically food service in different cafeterias, looking at the pattern of client retention. They found a significant number of high-profile clients were not renewing their service. Normal reaction to that is pressure on the sales organization. We need to do more sales training. We need to hire better sales execs. We need to have better customer relationships. They found there was almost no relationship between sales training and sales experience and customer retention. They did another extensive analysis, and they found that the single most highly predictive predictor of losing a client was an OSHA safety violation. If somebody slipped and fell or had a safety violation, the client would say, you know what, we don't want that vendor. We're going to change vendors. And it turned out that, of course, this company always knew that safety was important, but the safety training and the safety process was viewed as a compliance program, not a sales program, and it was sort of managed in the back office as an ongoing operational program. They moved it into the sales organization, and they said, now on, every quarter when we do a sales and client review, we're going to review of safety training and make sure that everybody on every one of these clients is trained and up to date on their safety, understanding of the safety procedures, because we know that has such an impact on client satisfaction. Again, an example of a sort of obvious but non-intuitive finding. Unplanned absences. Large automotive manufacturer I talked with a couple of weeks ago said they did an extensive analysis of unplanned absences. Unplanned absences in manufacturing has a very, very negative impact on productivity, because one day you come into the plant, you're missing a bunch of people, and you can't produce as many parts or widgets or cars or whatever it is that you were planning on producing. So you really want to know if a lot of people are going to call in sick that day. So they did a lot of analysis of this, and they found that, of course, one of the things they found is that people that worked on weekends were more likely to be sick on Monday, which, kind of makes sense. They found some obvious things. They also found a very high percentage of unplanned absences after the performance appraisal review, which gets back to this issue of how they were doing performance management. And so, again, having a finding isn't an answer, but so the answer was, okay, well, maybe we have a problem with the way we're doing performance appraisals. Maybe we should have more regular, frequent feedback sessions. and maybe we need to teach our managers a little bit more about how to be coaches, and a little bit more so they aren't so hard on our people. That he told me that had a significant impact on the productivity of their entire manufacturing organization. The issue of pay, a very, very big issue in every company. Large, very well-known professional services company had a lot of retention issues with very high-performing, very successful consultants. They looked at the distribution of pay, and they did an analysis, statistical analysis, and they found that people that were rated 1, or, the very highest rated people in performance, needed to make 115 to 120% of average salary in order to stay with the company. People rated 2 and 3 were happy with 85 to 90% of their benchmark salary. And, of course, they weren't paying people that differentiated. They actually had more of an equal pay across the different levels of performance. So they had to go back and really teach managers and actually give them some very proactive tools to reward the high performers at a higher rate, because there had been a real sort of socialistic compensation model that had been adopted in this company over many years, and it was creating this turnover problem of the high performers. Again, most of these projects, when you get the answer is kind of obvious, but you didn't have enough data to really come to that conclusion until you did the analysis. And, of course, the answer is not enough. You also have to figure out how to actually implement a solution. Here's another one. Large, pretty successful, well-known oil company. Actually, I worked for this company a long time ago. They have a very, very successful, methodical leadership development program in the United States. It involves job rotations from refining into marketing, back into operations, back and forth to different parts of the company. You have to be an engineer. They really don't like to promote people that don't have mechanical or chemical engineering background, and that's the way they've been running the company. It turned out that in Asia, where they had some of the fastest growing parts of their business, the people that were being promoted were completely different. They were people with economics degrees. They were not spending time in refineries the way they were in the United States. They were coming up the business in a completely different pattern, and they were turning out to be much better, more seasoned leaders than some of the leaders they were building in the United States. It forced them to really go back to their roots and rethink their whole kind of culture of how they had built this leadership pipeline and challenge whether the way they were doing it in the United States was correct. And that's the kind of thing that typically companies wouldn't change unless they really had data. And this is a very, very creative company, and they're going back and they're really rethinking their whole leadership development process as a result of that data. I love this one. And I know we're a little short on time, but I want to take you through one or two more examples. I want to open up for questions. So AMC Theaters, we've written case studies on these. That's the reason I'm giving you the clients' names. So as many of you know, if you've worked in a movie theater or you have any experience with movie theaters make all their money on the popcorn. The ticket sales more or less pay for the license of the movie, and then they make their profit on all the candy and Coke and popcorn and other stuff that you buy. And AMC found that there's a relationship between the happiness and sort of excitement of people and the amount of popcorn they buy. So they basically, the senior head of HR said, we need to teach our theater employees how to be happy and make it fun to be in the theater. So, of course, they did what most people do. They had a training program. They had a training program on how to greet people and how to be nice to people and how to tell jokes and how to make the place fun and keep it clean and all that. Turned out, after the training program, the variation in profitability didn't change at all. There were still some theaters that were really profitable and some theaters that were not. And none of the training seemed to have any impact on this issue of what would get people to buy more popcorn. And he said to me, I was in the shower one day and I suddenly occurred to me, you can't train people how to be happy. We have to hire people who are happy. So let's look at our sourcing strategy and who we're hiring. So he went back and he looked at all the interview guides and the sourcing tools they have, and what do they look for? They look for people who have been in leadership positions in school. They look for people who have good grades. They look for people that have been on sports teams. They had no qualifications or interview guidelines or sourcing tools to look at whether people would be happy or fun-loving or did anything that would be, that would translate into a fun experience at the theaters. So they went back and they redid the way they interviewed people, they redid the kinds of questions they asked, they redid the way they sourced people, and sure enough, a year or two later, their profitability went up by, I think it was 3 or 4%, which is a huge number for a company like that. Same exact story in cosmetic sales, and the story one there is a little bit funny. You know, the typical belief is that a good cosmetic salesperson will be somebody who's very attractive and knows how to put on makeup. And so, but of course, Bon-Ton stores found that that wasn't really correlating with sales performance. They did a very detailed analysis of the high performers, of the high sales performers against the average, and they found that, in fact, that it was cognitive ability, or IQ, that was much more highly related to cosmetic sales than whether somebody was necessarily attractive or knew how to put on makeup. Because the sale of makeup is a very complicated sale. There's a lot of products and there's a lot of decisions to be made very, very quickly in front of the customer. So again, changing the sourcing strategy had a direct impact on the bottom line. Anyway, I could go on and on with these questions. They're fascinating, and every company has them everywhere. And I think what you really want to do in people analytics is focus on the business problems, not just the HR problems. So what we've learned, if I go back on what we've talked about today, is this is a continuum of a long history of applying data to people in business. You have to consider it a journey. It's going to take you multiple years to put in place a robust solution. New platforms like Workday are going to make your job immensely easier than they have been in the past, but you still have to build the right team. You have to get budget allocated for a multi-year project. You have to have a multidisciplinary team. And you really should focus on the business problems first, not simply the HR problems around it. So I'm going to stop there. I think we've got about 5 minutes, and I'm happy to hang around for a little while for questions. Hopefully you found this educational, and turn it over to one of you guys, to Amy.
Great. Yes. Well, please enter your questions if you have them. Hopefully we'll have time to get to them. So the scenarios that you just shared, Josh, seem like nice big wins. Mm-hmm. But you say start with small wins. What are some examples of small wins that people could incorporate today?
Well, it's simple, very easy to perform analysis that just about any company could do would be to look at turnover by location, geography, manager. And just look at turnover data, which most companies do have, and it's usually reasonably accurate, and look at the patterns of turnover. And you will probably find things that are very helpful in understanding other issues that might be going on in the organization. Turnover itself may not be a bad thing. Sometimes companies want to have a certain amount of turnover, but they're indicators of other business issues that are going on in those parts of the organization. There might be management issues, training issues, compensation issues, some of the other ones. And that's usually data that's pretty easy to find, so you can start with that.
Great. That's a good one. You mentioned the difficulty of creating a data dictionary earlier. Do you have any recommendations on how to assemble that, how to get agreement, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, that's actually, if you find the right person to do it, it's really fun. People that are kind of geeky data people actually get a big kick out of that. You'll probably want to get somebody from IT to help you because some of the data is in systems that you don't really know anything about. So you probably need somebody in HR and somebody in IT to help you. I think it's a matter of finding a person that loves data. What I find in most of these analytics teams is that there are some business analysts, there are some statisticians, there are some consultants, and there are some data people. And the data people are people that have worked in the database industry or they've worked in some form of IT, and they actually are kind of get a kick out of doing this. So I think it's a matter of finding the right person.
Great. All right. Time for one or maybe two more questions. Do you have recommendations for a company starting to put together this team? What are some ways to garner excitement within their HR community?
Well, I think the best way to get started is to look at a problem that is a well enough understood problem that your business leaders and your senior head of HR will get behind the problem. Just pick one problem. That company I mentioned earlier It was dealing with culture. That's a well-known problem that's been socialized in that organization. And so the woman that's running that analytics group is so excited about working on that program that she knows that she's going to get CEO-level buy-in. She's a little bit scared of it, but she knows that she'll be able to do a good job, and she's very excited about it. So pick a problem that people generally around the company would be excited about you solving. And you're not going to solve it perfectly, but you're going, if you can get 30% better results on that particular problem than you're doing today, you're way ahead, and you'll pay for your project immediately.
All right. We've got a bunch coming in now. I think we just have time for one more question. How do you remove other factors when measuring business success? Economy, currency, politics, and other things that impact business success. And there were a couple of other questions similar to that were related about, making sure that we're not thinking it's causation versus correlation. So thoughts on that?
Yeah, there are statistical tools for causal analysis that will get you closer to finding a true cause. But one of the things that I've seen, at least my experience talking to a lot of companies, is that you're really not going to know that until you do the analysis and socialize it. Because there are things going on in the environment in your company that you're not aware of. So the example that I give is, one of the companies, actually I interviewed with a Workday client, was dealing with the issue of retention in their organization, and they did a lot of analysis. They cleaned up all the data. They looked at the retention. They went to this group in South America, and they said, look, you guys have a big retention problem. They went down there, and they visited with the business execs and talking about it. They said, well, yeah, we have a recession, and we have a lot of part-time workers. We know we have a retention problem. You haven't told us anything we don't already know. There's good reasons for it. So I don't think you should try to come up with a perfect correlation. It won't happen. You're going to have to do the best you can using the best statistical tools you can and go out and socialize it with the business. People analytics will never be a perfect science. We're always dealing with the imperfections of humans. But if you can be a little bit smarter about who to hire, how to manage people, how to pay people, how to move people from place to place, you're going to be way ahead of where you were before. So don't get too worried about making the answer perfect.
That's a great conclusion. Don't be too worried about making the answer perfect. Just get started with those small wins. Thanks so much, Josh. That's really great advice for all of us.
You're welcome, Amy. It's been my pleasure.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for joining us today, everyone. Hope you have a great work day.